Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin last met in person in Japan in 2019. After their latest call, could these same hands soon be shaking on a Ukraine peace deal? The US president certainly thinks so.
I think some progress has been made. It's a terrible situation going on over there. 5,000 young people every single week are being killed. So hopefully we did something. We also spoke to the heads of most of the European nations, and we're trying to get that whole thing wrapped up. What a shame that it ever started in the first place.
Trump's Russian counterpart was less forthcoming.
The US president expressed his position regarding the cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire. And I, for my part, also said that Russia supports a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. We must simply determine the most effective paths towards peace.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he'd asked Trump to ensure that those paths be determined with Kyiv's involvement.
I asked him before his conversation with Putin not to make decisions about Ukraine without us. For us, these are matters of principle and very important. We agreed that we would get in touch after his conversation with Putin.
Zelensky was among a host of European leaders whom Trump briefed after the call. He said Ukraine was now considering setting up a meeting with the leaders of Russia, the United States, EU countries and Britain. And a venue has already been suggested by the new American incumbent at the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV, who was meeting US Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Trump says he thinks it might be the ideal place for Putin to call time on the war.
I think he's had enough. This has been a long time. This has been going on for more than 3 years. There's tremendous bitterness, anger, and I think maybe that could help some of that anger. So having it at the Vatican would be, in Rome, would be a great idea. Thank you.
But it remains just an idea, with the Kremlin saying that the root causes of the conflict need to be eliminated before any deal is struck.
Let's bring in our correspondent Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington, D.C. Welcome back, Ben. President Trump appears to have achieved a significant breakthrough.
That's right. That's at least how he's portraying it. He said we made some advance there. There was a pretty long press release that was shared by Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying that it went very well. 2 hours. The remarks that he just said, he spoke about 2.5 hours. And then afterwards, he spoke to several European leaders, as he just mentioned, the president of the European Commission, the German chancellor, the president of France, also the Finnish president. That's also quite interesting that he included him in his talks. But there was not a lot in this press release on what the conditions are, basically, on Ukrainians and on Russians. It said that the negotiations are happening and also that the Vatican would play an important role there as mediators. And that's especially interesting considering that both Vice President J.D. Vance and also Secretary of State Marco Rubio had a private meeting with Pope Leo XIV. So we might see what happens there, but there is one press release now, but the important thing is what will happen, what will follow afterwards, and what will actually work different this time. If we look back to last week in Turkey, where only the Ukrainian president and not the Russian president was sitting at the table there during those ceasefire talks in Istanbul.
OK, so we heard President Putin saying he's ready to talk. What's Kyiv saying?
So what we've heard from Ukraine and also from Ukrainian sources is that the US President Donald Trump had a phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky before talking to Putin and also afterwards, because if we read this readout, it almost appears as if he spoke about the story of negotiations with Vladimir Putin and then told the Ukrainian president that this will actually be happening. The Ukrainian president has been trying to put some pressure on the US president, telling him that it's not them, but it's the Russian president that does not want to end this war. And that's also what J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been telling journalists in Rome, that he does not believe or does not see that Putin actually has an exit strategy. And he wanted President Trump to actually be also pretty clear on that, to ask Vladimir Putin, do you want to see this war? And so it can be seen as a success, but it always is important to get the little details in there. And unfortunately, that's not something that we got in this press release. Donald Trump also spoke about trade opportunities for both Russia and for both Ukraine. And that also shows a little bit how he portrays himself as this deal maker, where this business is also so important, not just with those two countries, but also if we look back at the last week where President Trump went to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. The trade and business always plays an important role for this deals that the White House likes to portray. And of course, it's putting additional pressure on President Trump, who promised that he would end this war in 24 hours. He afterwards said that it was an exaggeration, but this is one of his main campaign promises, to bring an end to the war. So that's also for him so important to kind of portray himself as this deal maker that is talking to both sides, because the White House is portraying the administration of former President Joe Biden as someone who was not trying to find these conversations, not talking to the Russian side. And there have been many conversations from the White House, not from US President Donald Trump, but from his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who has met with the Russian president several times in Moscow now.
Thanks for that, Ben. Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington. Well, as we heard, President Trump said he had been briefing his European counterparts on that call with President Putin. So let's bring in our correspondent, Simon Young. Welcome, Simon. What are you hearing from European capitals?
Yeah, Phil, well, it seems as if on the call after talking to Putin, Trump spoke with Zelensky, as we've heard, but on that call as well, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the leaders of Germany, France, Finland and Italy. And the reaction relatively positive. Ursula von der Leyen of the EU saying that she wants to thank the president for his efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine, but also saying it's very important that the United States stays engaged in this process. And here in Berlin, Chancellor Merz's spokesman said that what had been agreed essentially is the Europeans and Donald Trump would continue to work together, talking about next steps. And had sort of reaffirmed their willingness to closely accompany Ukraine on its path towards a ceasefire. But they also said, and this was emphasised, that they would step up pressure on Russia through sanctions. And that's, of course, a slightly different sort of emphasis from the one that Donald Trump's been giving, who's talking about normalising relations with Russia and increased trade in the future and so on.
Interesting, because there had been fears that the Europeans were being sidelined in this process. Does Europe now have a seat at the negotiating table?
Yeah, well, it certainly has had. The Europeans, I think, have begun to work out how to deal with Trump, President Trump going off on his own way when it comes to dealing with Ukraine, Russia. And the Europeans didn't want to be left behind or overtaken by Trump's deal making. So they've repeatedly now appeared in these groups of 4 and 5 with the Polish Prime Minister, or today with the Italian Prime Minister there. They've kept the UK on side, which is important. And they've talked about their role in any future peace, securing any future peace in Ukraine. But you can also ask, what does it amount to? Before the call today between Trump and Putin, the Europeans spoke to the US president, said you should apply maximum pressure. What's come out of it? Putin is saying, well, I'll work on a memorandum towards possibly having a ceasefire. It's a pretty paltry result. And the Europeans are still reduced essentially to waiting for the phone to ring from Washington to find out what Trump has agreed. That's not a comfortable position to be in.
Thanks for that, Simon. DW political correspondent Simon Young.
It's a great time to be talking to William Courtney. He's a former US ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia and the US Soviet Commission. He's also Adjunct Senior Fellow at the RAND think tank in the US. Welcome to the program. Great to have you on. We've heard from Trump, Putin and Zelensky through the day now. A lot of words spoken. Are we closer to peace, do you think?
The Trump administration has been consistently more optimistic than has Russia. And so today, as you pointed out, President Trump said it went very well, but President Putin said it was a very frank discussion. In diplomatic terms, very frank is about as harsh as you can be in terms of describing a disagreement. So it doesn't look like things are going so well. And President Putin's comment, somewhat consistent with the failure of the talks in Istanbul a couple of days ago, in which the Russian side showed no interest whatsoever in agreeing to a ceasefire.
Is there a part of this process? Zelensky says this is a defining moment. Putin was more circumspect. You paint that picture beautifully. Aside from the grand dream of peace, is there a part of this process that is about forcing Putin to lay down his cards for the world to see, for the Trump administration to see how willing he is to truly engage here?
Putin has laid down his cards consistently. For example, he said earlier and today as well that the root causes of the conflict need to be addressed. In Putin's perspective, root causes means that Ukraine should no longer be a sovereign state, that its military should be fundamentally demilitarized. So those are root causes that certainly the West and Ukraine would not accept. Once Putin, if he ever moves away from that language, there may be some possibility of a negotiation that could achieve some progress is possible. But thus far, there's no sign of that.
So with that as the backdrop, as the context, do you expect these negotiations to, as Donald Trump says, start immediately?
Oh, there could be negotiations that start soon. So one of the things we should look at, for example, is who is the head of the Russia delegation. In Istanbul, Russia did not send a senior diplomat such as Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. It sent a propagandist, an ideological propagandist, as the head of the group. So that was a pretty sure sign that they weren't talking about real negotiation. Let's see who they involve in the negotiation, and let's see if they start pulling away from some of this outlandish position, such as identifying or solving the root causes of the conflict.
So the who is really important, as you outlay. The where is also very interesting. One possible location for further negotiations seems to be the Vatican. As a former diplomat of decades, why would you say this is? What makes that such a suitable venue for talks?
Well, Pope Leo apparently said something to that effect, which is a normal sort of thing for a Vatican leader to say. But the Russian Orthodox Church, which views the Catholic Church as a decadent competitor, a Russian Orthodox Church would be strongly opposed to the Vatican. And so President Putin would be very unlikely to agree to the Vatican. Turkey is a place where the Russians feel comfortable, the West feels comfortable. So my guess is that if there's going to be a continued negotiation, Turkey might be one of the places that could take place.
So to keep these fires burning, what steps need to be taken now to ensure that negotiations are kept going and that the different sides actually reach a ceasefire deal or head in that direction or even a peace deal?
Well, there's a real question whether negotiations need to go ahead right now because the sides are just so far apart and the Russians have been so maximalist in their demands. It's not clear negotiations right now are or should be an urgent priority for the Western side and Ukraine. But if they do take place, that may be helpful in enabling the West and Ukraine to elucidate and show to the world the position of Russia and how out of realism that position is. Thus far, President Zelensky has been very clever in boxing Putin in because President Zelensky has accepted President Trump's proposal for a full and unconditional ceasefire, President Putin keeps saying no and tries to deflect attention from that issue by proposing more negotiations on a larger peace agreement. It's premature for that kind of negotiation.
William, great to get your insights. William Courtney from the Rand think tank, many thanks. All right, let's bring in Joshua Shifrinson. He's a Senior Fellow at the CATO Institute and Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. Good to see you, Joshua. I want to start with your take on the significance of Trump's latest diplomacy efforts. Is the announced start of a joint memorandum more than you perhaps expected, or just more promising words?
Well, I think going into these talks, whenever senior leaders are speaking, there's an element of the theatrical as well as an element of the substantive. I think an agreement to discuss a memorandum is about the kick the can down the road solution that we were talking about. But also it's important to remember that the form of the ceasefire, whatever it takes, be it a memorandum, be it a just freeze in place on the ground, that's less significant than the fact that the fighting itself abates. And to get there, we're going to have to see both Russia and Ukraine and the United States and the European allies, of course, come to a broader understanding of what a long-term stability option looks like for the Eastern Front.
Joshua, should we be focusing on this peace process with genuine hope that it could lead to peace, or is it perhaps more significant that this may be the last stop before the US walks away entirely?
Well, I don't think it's likely that the U.S. will walk away entirely, certainly not from Europe in general. But I think the fact that we're having these discussions in different parties, the U.S., the European partners, Ukraine, Russia, and so on, are indicating exactly how far they're willing to go to continue the conflict. That gives me hope that all sides are coming to kind of an understanding as to what the balance of power looks like on the Eastern Front, how far each one is willing to go, both now and in the future. And as a result, I think we are seeing the kernels of a peace process emerging.
Do you think Donald Trump still has leverage, and is he prepared to use it?
I think Trump does absolutely have leverage. It's not simply the carrot option of relieving Russia of sanctions that we're talking about here. Of course, he's such an individual that he could choose to ramp up aid again to Ukraine if he so wanted to. However, I don't have any sense that he's willing to use his leverage. He seems to really want to reduce America's involvement in the Ukraine conflict specifically, and perhaps Europe in general, in order to focus on other parts of the world, certainly the U.S. at home. And so I don't think Trump is willing to use the leverage that he could have in his back pocket.
I guess that part of that landscape is his voters. Do you think the MAGA voters, if you want to call them that, care much about what happens next in potential negotiations? Will there be any significant blowback for Trump if it proves to be that Putin was stalling all along?
Yeah, no, I think it's very possible that Trump himself may become irate that Putin was trolling him and pulling him along all along. However, American public opinion, not just on the GOP side, the Republican side, but really across the political spectrum, support for Ukraine has been falling for about 2 years now. And so if Trump were to reduce America's role in the Ukraine conflict even further, I don't expect much domestic blowback unless Trump himself begins to mobilize around it, in which case the blowback wouldn't so much be blowback as a orchestrated political movement.
One more before we go. Trump did talk to European leaders after his call with Putin. Can Europe now claim to have a genuine seat at the table as they have wanted?
They can't claim to have a role at the table in the way they wanted. What they can do, though, is affect events on the ground. And indeed, we've seen since the Trump administration came into office and announced its intent to walk back American support for Ukraine, we've seen the European Union, members of the EU, European members of NATO, really step up their assistance to Ukraine. That tangible support to Kyiv is by definition going to give them a voice in any negotiation. And so while they don't have a formal seat at the table at this time, their very presence, their actions on the ground are going to give them leverage over the end result.
Joshua Shifrinson from the University of Maryland. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.